The Odyssey is full of things that cannot possibly have happened. One-eyed giants, a monster in a strait, a witch with a drug that steals men's minds. 7 of them turned out to have something real underneath. We're counting down from 7, and they get harder to dismiss as we go. Stay with me to number 1. It's the one that makes it hardest to believe Homer invented this world from nothing. Number 7, the Cyclops. Start with the monster everybody knows. Odysseus lands on an island. He finds a cave. And in the cave, he finds a giant with one eye set in the center of his forehead, who eats 2 of his men and seals the rest inside with a boulder. So, where does a creature like that come from? Not from memory. Nobody has ever met a Cyclops. But Greek sailors did land on Sicily, the island the poem has always been read as pointing to. And in the limestone caves of that island, something was waiting that no Greek had ever seen alive. Dwarf elephants. Elephants that had shrunk generation after generation until the smallest of them stood about a meter at the shoulder, an adult elephant the size of a large dog. When they died in the limestone caves, what they left behind was a skull far bigger than any human skull and shaped nothing like one. And an elephant skull has a problem. The trunk needs somewhere to attach. So in the middle of the face, where you would expect a nose, there is one vast opening, bigger than either eye socket, and right in the center. Look at it without ever having seen a living elephant, and you are not looking at an animal. You are looking at the head of a one-eyed giant. A paleontologist called Othenio Abel put that in print in 1914. Handle it carefully. Abel overreached. He claimed ancient writers had identified these bones as Cyclops remains, and no surviving text says any such thing. Plenty of scholars think the idea is simply too neat. But the caves are real, the skulls are real, and they lay in those Sicilian hillsides for thousands of years, waiting for people who had no idea what an elephant was. That's the first one, a monster that might just be a misread bone. Hold on to that idea, because it is about to happen again, and the next time, you can go and stand in it. Number 6, the monster in the Strait. Odysseus is warned about a narrow channel of water with a horror on either side. On one cliff, Scylla, 6 heads on 6 long necks that come down and take 6 men off the deck as the ship passes. On the other, Charybdis, not a creature but a mouth in the sea itself, that swallows the water 3 times a day and vomits it back up, and any ship caught over it goes down. He is told he cannot avoid both. He has to choose which one takes his men. Now, that is one of the most frightening passages in the poem. And it is also a set of sailing directions. Because the strait is there. It's the Strait of Messina, the 2-mile gap between Sicily and the toe of Italy. And to this day, 2 different bodies of water with different densities and different tidal rhythms meet inside it. What that produces is a phenomenon the Italians still have a name for. Standing whirlpools. Water that turns on itself on a tidal schedule, strong enough to spin a small wooden boat and hold it. Not 3,000 years ago. Now. You can watch it from the shore. Homer isn't describing a monster. He's describing the most dangerous piece of water a Bronze Age sailor was ever likely to attempt. And he is describing it well enough that you could navigate by it. Which raises a question that only gets bigger from here. How does a poet know that? Number 5, the drug. Odysseus's men reach the island of the witch Circe. She gives them something to drink and they lose themselves. In the poem, they are turned into pigs. Odysseus is warned. He is given a plant to protect him. And Homer does something here he almost never does. He describes it. Black at the root. A flower as white as milk. Dangerous for mortals to dig up. He gives it a name, Molly. And then the poem moves on, and for 25 centuries, nobody could say what he was talking about. In 1983, 2 neurologists published a paper about it. They started with the symptoms. Read what Circe's cup actually does to those men. The confusion, the lost memory, the crew who no longer know themselves. And it stops sounding like a fairy tale. It sounds like a poisoning, a specific one. And there are plants that do exactly that, growing all over the Mediterranean and well known to the ancient world. Mandrake, henbane, deadly nightshade. Eat them and you hallucinate. Afterwards, you remember none of it. So, if you wanted to protect a man from that, what would you have to hand him? Something that works against it. Not vaguely, chemically, precisely, in the opposite direction. There is one plant in that part of the world that does. Its bulb gave us a drug still used in hospitals today. Black root, white flower, the snowdrop. If they are right, and it is still argued over, a study revisited the whole question only last year. Then, a throwaway scene in a 3,000-year-old poem may be the oldest surviving description of one drug being used to reverse the effects of another. Nobody thinks Homer was a chemist. That is the problem, because somebody, somewhere back down the long chain of people who told this story before him, evidently knew. That's a bone, a strait, and a working piece of pharmacology. Notice what all three have in common. They are things, an object, a place, a plant. Not one of them has a person in it. Now, it stops being details. Now, it's a city. Number 4, Troy. For most of recorded history, Troy was understood to be fictional, a stage set. The place you put a story about heroes, the way you'd say once upon a time. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy German businessman went to look for it with a copy of Homer in his hand. Heinrich Schliemann was not an archaeologist. He was a man who had made a fortune in indigo and gold rush banking, and who had decided, against every expert opinion available to him, that the Iliad was a record of something that happened. He went to northwestern Turkey to a mound above the plain called Hisarlik, a site an English diplomat named Frank Calvert had already identified and already begun to dig, a detail Schliemann would spend the rest of his life quietly stepping in front of. And he started cutting. What came out of that mound broke the argument open. Not a city. 9 of them. 9 settlements, each built on the ruins of the last. A mound made of its own wreckage, a place people had destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again for 3,000 years. Walls, towers, a gate, burn layers. One of those cities, the 6th, shows heavy earthquake damage. The one above it shows something else. Hurried repairs, houses subdivided, storage jars sunk into the floors. The archaeologist who dug it read that as a city stockpiling, bracing for a siege. Not everyone accepts that reading, but it is what he found in the ground. So Troy is real. It's a place. You can buy a ticket. And the man who proved it was lying to you about almost everything else. In 1873, Schliemann announced that he had found treasure. Gold, thousands of pieces of it. Diadems, earrings, vessels, a headdress of woven gold chains. He called it Priam's treasure after the king in the poem, and he had his young Greek wife Sophia photographed wearing it. That photograph is still one of the most famous images in archaeology. It is also, in almost every meaningful respect, a fiction. The gold is real. But it came out of the second city in the mound, and the second city dates to around 2400 BC, more than 1,000 years before any war Homer could possibly be describing. Whoever wore that headdress died before the Trojan War was a story anyone could have told. Schliemann's account of finding it doesn't survive scrutiny either. He placed Sophia at his side at the moment of discovery. She was in Athens, and there is worse. To reach the bottom of the mound, he drove an enormous trench straight down through the middle of it. And the layers he tore out and threw aside on his way to the wrong city were the layers that mattered. The Troy he was looking for was very likely among the layers he cut through to get there. I'm telling you this because it's the test everything else in this video has to pass. A man who wanted the poem to be true went looking and found something spectacular, and it was the wrong thing, and he lied about it anyway. So, which of these actually survives that? Which of them holds up when the person examining it has no interest in Homer being right? 3 of them. And the last one, the one still lying in a museum case with writing baked into it, changed the argument completely. Number 3. The horse. The most famous object in Western literature isn't in the Odyssey's main story at all. It's remembered inside it, a hollow wooden horse left outside the walls, dragged in by the Trojans themselves. Here is the problem. Nobody has ever found a shred of evidence for it. No timber, no wheels, no trace. And as a plan, it is, frankly, absurd. You have to believe a city under siege for 10 years found an enormous wooden object left behind by the men trying to kill them, and decided to pull it through their own gates. So either the most famous trick in history never happened, or it happened, and we have spent 3,000 years picturing it wrong. There are 2 serious attempts at the second answer. Both start from the same question. What could stand outside a city's walls, made of wood, and end with that city falling? One answer comes from Assyrian warfare. And note the date, because it matters. These are machines from Homer's own era, not from the Bronze Age war he is describing. The Assyrians built siege engines, heavy wheeled frames carrying a battering ram, pushed up against a city wall. To stop defenders setting them alight, they covered them in soaked animal hides, and they gave them animal names. A wooden frame, covered in horsehide, pushed up to the gates of a city, men inside it. You do not need to change a single element of that description to get Homer's horse. You only need 400 years, and a poet working from a story that had already been retold 1,000 times. The other answer is quieter, and I find it harder to shake. Poseidon is god of the sea. He is also god of earthquakes, and god of horses. And the 6th city in that mound, as we said, was heavily damaged by an earthquake. A city whose walls come down. A horse that brought them down. The same god behind both words. We don't know. We may never know. But notice what has happened to the question. It is no longer did they build a horse. It is what really happened that a poet 4 centuries later could only describe as one. 2 left, and both of them stop being about things and start being about people. Number 2, the house on the hill. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to get to one place. Ithaca, a small island in the Ionian Sea, and in the poem, the seat of a king. There is a real island called Ithaca. There always has been. But an island isn't a palace, and for a very long time, there was nothing on it to suggest a king had ever lived there. Then, a team from the University of Ioannina spent 17 years digging a terraced hillside in the north of the island, at a place local people had called, for generations, and for no reason anyone could explain, the School of Homer. What came out of the ground was a Mycenaean building, not a farmhouse, a complex. Cyclopean walls built from stones too large to lift. A staircase cut directly into the bedrock. Cisterns, workshops, storage rooms, occupations stretching back to around 1900 BC and running right through the Bronze Age. In 2010, the excavations director said publicly what he believed it was: the Palace of Odysseus. For years that was contested, and fairly. It was a building without a name. And then, in 2025, they found one. Inscribed roof tiles lifted from the terraces. Greek letters cut into the clay before it was fired. One of them carries his name in the possessive, of Odysseus. Another is a dedication to Odysseus. So the site has a name on it now. Read the date before you celebrate. Those tiles are Hellenistic, cut the better part of 1,000 years after the Bronze Age. They do not tell us that Odysseus lived here. They tell us that people here worshipped him, that this hillside held a sanctuary to Odysseus, and that his name was worth carving into a roof. That is not evidence that he existed. It is evidence that they were certain he had. Look at what we have. A bone, a strait, a flower, a city, a shrine. Every one of them a thing people left behind. Which leaves one question. Was there ever anyone who carried the name? Number 1. The tablet. Here is the tablet. In the palaces of Bronze Age Greece, At Pylos, at Knossos, scribes kept records on soft clay tablets, lists, inventories, how much grain, how many sheep, who owed what to whom. Bureaucracy, the least romantic writing imaginable. Nobody could read it. The script was called Linear B, and for 50 years it defeated every scholar who tried, until in 1952, a young English architect named Michael Ventris cracked it, and proved to nearly everyone's astonishment that the language underneath was Greek. Greek, 400 years earlier than anyone had believed Greek was written. And the tablets survived for a reason worth sitting with. Clay tablets are fragile. These were baked hard, permanent, by the fires that destroyed the palaces they were sitting in. The last day of those kingdoms is the only reason we can read their paperwork. So, what's on them? Names. Hundreds of names of ordinary Bronze Age people. Shepherds, bronze smiths, men who owed the palace a quantity of grain. Most of them mean nothing to anyone now. Names that died with the men who carried them. And then there are the ones that didn't. Archireu, Achilles, Ekoto, Hector. 400 years before Homer. On tax records. Now, be careful what you take from that. This is not proof that Achilles existed. It is very nearly the opposite. These were ordinary names carried by ordinary people. A man called Achilles who owned a chariot and 2 horses and 2 sets of armor, and whose entire surviving trace in this world is a line in a palace inventory. But think about what that actually means for the poem. It means Homer wasn't naming his heroes out of thin air. He was reaching back into a real world, a world of real palaces, real kings, real Greek-speaking people with those exact names, that had burned to the ground 4 centuries before he was born and had survived only in songs. He wasn't inventing, he was remembering, imperfectly, across 400 years of oral retelling, through a fog of gods and monsters, but remembering something that was actually there. That's the answer, as far as we have one. The Odyssey is not history. Odysseus is not a man you can dig up, but it is not invention either, not in the way a novel is invention. It is a memory of a lost world, handed down by people who had no writing left, and so put everything they could not afford to lose into a story. The skull in the cave, the whirlpool in the Strait, the flower with the black root, the 9 cities in the mound, the name on the tablet. Every one of those was, at some point, filed under myth, which ought to make you wonder what else is. Because the world Homer was remembering didn't just fade. Within about 50 years, either side of 1200 BC, almost every kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean burned. Mycenae, Troy, the Hittite capital, all of it. And nobody has ever fully explained why. That's the next one. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, the evidence sitting underneath the oldest stories we have, subscribe. That's all we do here. Ilaris Archives. Thank you for watching.